the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. On this episode, my guest is Soren Kaplan, the author of the new book, Experiential Intelligence, Harness the Power of Experience for Personal and Business Breakthroughs. Soren shares how his unusual early life experiences shaped his resilience and framework through which he saw the world, and how this essential third level of intelligence after IQ and EQ makes for successful, agile, and resilient leaders. Soren, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Well, thanks so much for joining me on the pod. Where am I finding you today?
I'm up in Bellingham, Washington, which is right above Seattle and below Vancouver, Canada.
Well, listen, thanks again for joining me. I'm looking forward to hearing all about the book and what I got lots of questions that I'm really keen to get into with. But let's start a little bit about the beginning. Let's start with a bit about yourself, your background, and what you do for a living.
I've done strategy and innovation consulting work for many years, about 25 years, formerly ran the strategy group at Hewlett-Packard, HP in Silicon Valley, and probably worked with 30 of the Fortune 1000 from Visa, Red Bull, L'Oreal, Kimberly-Clark, Colgate, and even the National Association of Convenience Stores. And it's all about innovation and leading for innovation. And then a couple of years ago, I also started a software company focused on taking a lot of those best practices that I'd been kind of doing individually and trying to scale those up and make them available to teams and organizations.
Now, normally at this point in the podcast, I'd ask the guest, in your youth, were you always oriented to do these things? You've got a very interesting story about your youth I want to get to real quick, because typically I'd say, hey, did you stumble into this or were you always interested in business? But your pathway is very interesting. So let's just jump right in and talk about the book, Experiential Intelligence, Harness the Power of Experience for Personal and Business Breakthroughs. So first of all, not your first book. You're an award-winning author. You're probably familiar with the process of creating books and publishing and editing and getting them into market, but does it get any easier writing the books? And what's your tradecraft for how you write the next book?
That's a great question. The process for me is easier when I bring my whole self to it and I'm really tapping in on what I know, which is why this third book of mine was probably easier to write than the others. And on the other hand, a little harder because it required me to dig deep at the same time. So probably a little bit of a different process, but for me, it was a little bit easier, actually.
Now, did you set every day I need to write so many words, just the practical tradecraft, or did it all come out and then get edited, or was it really, how did it come out?
I don't operate that way. Like I need 1,000, 2,000 words a day. I let my energy and kind of motivation let that guide me. So in certain days, I might write 10, 15,000 words, other days, 0. And so, my book really is trying to encapsulate what I've learned over 25 years working with leaders in a lot of organizations and my personal experience in some of the challenges that I've had and leading, my consulting firm and doing startups, but also, how do I tap into strengths that I've got and how I've seen other leaders do the same. And so it was, certain days I'd feel motivated and certain days I wouldn't, and I didn't push it. I kind of let, kind of what I've learned about how innovation works guide me.
Oh, that's interesting. Who'd you write the book for? Who should read it?
I wrote it for any leader who wants to take themselves to the next level, but recognizing that taking themselves to the next level also means taking their teams to the next level as well. So it's really, leaders who are working with teams that want, much higher performance from the standpoint of innovation and collaboration, but recognizing you got to sort of go deep and be a little vulnerable and create, psychological safety for your team to do so.
All right. Well, let's start with the basics. What is experiential intelligence? Let's start there. Lots of questions, probably too many for us, our time together, but maybe there'll be a follow-up. But let's start with the basics. What's experiential intelligence?
So we've known that intellect, IQ, is important. And about 35 years ago or so, we learned about emotional intelligence, EQ.
Mm-hmm. EQ, yeah.
In today's world, a lot's changed in 30, 35 years. We've got, artificial intelligence. We've got lots of disruption from technology happening out there. We've got whole new business models. The notion that IQ and EQ are sufficient to really understand what leads to personal and professional success just isn't enough. And it's sort of a no-brainer, but of course the experiences we have in life as well as in business are the third leg of the stool. I just call it experiential intelligence to complement emotional and intelligence and intellect. And your experiences actually are a form of develop a form of intelligence that you can, leverage and use. And some people call it street smarts. Other people just call it the 10,000 hour rule. But, experiential intelligence is a real form of intelligence that was created by the past president of the American Psychological Association and introduced the term. And then I've kind of blown it out and kind of created a framework around it with tools and things like that.
And you go on in the book to call it XQ, right? Just so that we have this compartmentalizing of IQ and EQ. Now it's XQ, right? So we can refer to it that later. You wrote the book during an interesting time in our lives. Any as you reflect on that time during the COVID era and the craziness that went on, did it impact your writing, and did you reflect upon your lessons learned for that time?
Oh, it absolutely did. I think like a lot of people during COVID, I reflected on my purpose and what was going on in the world and how I fit into it. And it really did conjure up some past experiences of mine and kind of looking at how I came to be in this crazy world we're in. And so, to kind of quickly summarize it, when I was 3, my mother developed a mental illness. By the time my father was rarely around. He was working multiple jobs. He was kind of focused on some spiritual pursuits of his. And by the time I was 15 years old, we had moved 16 times. Wow. And so I grew up with incredible uncertainty and by all, kind of psychological measures, some trauma. And I had to overcome a lot of that. And it was hurting some of my relationships and business and my personal life. So I did a lot of work on that. But what I also realized is that the same things that traumatized me actually instilled and helped me develop some great strengths, like living with ambiguity, making decisions at the last minute with limited data, understanding people's motivations and reading body language in really uncertain situations, which I've been able to do in some of the organizational leadership and culture work I've done. So the same things that shape us through our experiences that can limit us also can deliver really unique strengths. And experiential intelligence is about understanding both sides of those things and then overcoming the things holding you back and leaning into the things that you've gained through your experiences. They don't have to be bad experiences. They can be joyous and they can be fun, whatever they were. And so that's what experiential intelligence is all about.
I mean, you're treading on, and you mentioned him in the book, some familiar territory, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. It said, a little bit of trouble or adversity in our lives is a good thing. At some point, there's just too much adversity to overcome. But do you think that, just reflecting back again on the COVID era, that was a little bit of adversity for everybody? And, if there's anything that comes out of that craziness, we're a little more agile or a little more resilient? Do you have any perception around that?
I think you just started to summarize it. We all had a collective experience during COVID. We all respond to our experiences differently. Generally, we have our own responses, but, we had a collective experience and we all had to live with uncertainty. We all had to live with ambiguity. And so I do believe as we are continuing to move through what those couple years, created in our environment for us individually and as a society and as societies, we will recognize that it instilled certain, mindsets around resilience and the need to support other people and the recognition that we are a global community now that's interdependent. And, I think we have an opportunity to take that new mindset, collective mindset, and do good things with it. and I know we have a lot of polarization and conflict these days.
I was going to say, sometimes it's hard to see that as an outcome from the COVID era, that we're all in it together. I mean, ripped from the headlines, pick any given day, and whether it's Europe or Southeast Asia, it doesn't feel like we're all in it together. It doesn't feel like we learned a lesson there, but maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's deeper than we know. What do you think?
Well, I'm articulating something that I know others also view, that there's fundamental interdependence, and there is, we all proved that we had some resilience. Yeah. Now, what we decide to do with that is another question. I do believe that there's kind of this collective, understanding of those principles to a certain extent. And, how we then respond to, what's driving us from a fear-based standpoint or from a competitive standpoint. We can let certain things drive our behavior, or we can recognize maybe some of our learnings and try to reframe and help others see more positive possibilities.
Let's build on your experiences and this framework for innovation, because that's really what we're here to talk about, and it's what you're such an expert on. So I can't not have you on the mic and talk about this. Is there a risk of being a prisoner of your experience? Does it work the other way that Steve Dennis and you and I were talking off mic. We both know Steve Dennis, and he often says, why does it take a crisis for people to innovate? Can you be trapped in your prior experiences, and your book is really about breaking through that, as I read it. But talk about that. You wind up with a framework so rigid that it's just difficult to break through with genuine innovation. Talk about your experiences in that.
I'm gonna dumb this down really quick, and then I'll share a personal example. So think about how you learn how to ride a bike. You didn't use necessarily your intellect to figure that out. You tried it out, and you fell over. You might have had training wheels. Eventually, you learned to steer with the handlebars and brake. Mm-hmm. Those are your base skills. And then if you practice a little bit more, maybe you could anticipate bumps or potholes, or figure out how to ride defensively around traffic. Those are higher order abilities. And then you have mindsets. So, if you have a good experience riding a bike, you might realize that you can use it for transportation or socializing with friends and maybe adventure. So those are your mindsets around riding a bike. Now, if you are falling over a lot, or maybe you fell over and you got embarrassed in front of your friends, you might develop a mindset that, you don't want to be embarrassed again, and that a bike is a tool to be embarrassed. And so you may not resonate with riding bikes. Or if you got hurt, you might have a mindset, this bike is dangerous. I don't want to put myself in harm's way. And so those same kinds of, those mindsets, abilities, and know-how, which are make up experiential intelligence, are at play all the time. And so, that's just a very simple example that most of us could relate to. My other personal example I talk about, it's a very simple one. I went to buy a car with my father when I was a teenager. Very uncomfortable situation. The salesperson, it was kind of like a bait and switch kind of tactic. Mm-hmm. They were kind of notoriously known for unethical sales practices. But in those 15 minutes, I saw my father get really uncomfortable. I saw, kind of these interactions. I was pretty silent during the time. I was just observing it. But I took away salespeople, this mindset and this belief, salespeople can't be trusted. And so that has got in my way over time around how I interact with people who are just trying to help me out. Or, if I'm trying to just be in situations where I'm negotiating a partnership, I have this lack of trust that I'm, have now aware of, that was, I think, impacting kind of how I showed up and my behavior. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I also recognize it's important to understand people's motivations. And I took that mindset away from that interaction too, which has led me to, a lot of innovation work where you're doing empathy research with customers and trying to really understand deeply where people are coming from. I've done a lot of mediation work as well in teams and with leaders. And so one experience delivered something that got in my way, and also something that has led me to develop other abilities and skills that I've really used. So being in touch with that whole of what we're getting from an experience, both the limiters as well as the expanders, if you will, is an important attribute if you're able to do that.
It's a concept you talk about, hidden assets. I think you were talking about something you described as hidden assets within your experiences, kind of like taking potentially negative experiences and reframing or learning. And it reminded me of Dan Pink, and he talks about the power of regret. Never doesn't like people saying, I have no regrets. Not welcome your regrets, but recognize them and then learn from them. Is that basically what you're articulating as well? That same kind of for every experience. I mean, I think you just basically articulated with the car sales example, right? So you got both positive and negative from it.
It is, and I think that the challenge sometimes is that we don't look into our past to understand what we gained from it, and it's a little bit more than just what did we learn from it. Like we may or may not be conscious of what was instilled in us from a mindset standpoint. When mindset's your attitudes and beliefs about yourself, other people, and the world. So, being able to go a little bit deeper, understand how an experience really impacted you, whether it was, kind of a little experience or whether it was a bigger traumatic experience or whether it was just an amazing, joyous experience. Like, what am I taking away from that? That's shaping me and leading me to do things maybe on autopilot or consciously into the future. So it's more than learning. It's really, it shapes who we become as people, and being more mindful and insightful about those experiences and how they impacted us, give us more control and help us find those assets to leverage, not just in ourselves, but even in other people.
Let's pivot a bit, kind of all the way back to the beginning. You talked about a book written for leaders. Let's talk about advice to leaders. There's a very boisterous conversation going on right now in business, at least, around in-person versus remote work. And so you might have leaders who are leading teams of people in person or remote or local or global. How can our personal influence amplify the strengths in our teams? You talk about building basically your experiential intelligence at the team level, which I found really fascinating. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, there's a number of different techniques you can use. I wrote an HBR article on how to, what I call, hire outside the box, which basically means, if you're trying to hire, onto your team, certain, skills and abilities, you may not necessarily want to be stuck to the typical job descriptions that HR is giving you. You may want to look for people, who have much broader, diverse experiences. I mean, I look at like international travel. I hired someone recently who had traveled alone. She was 22 years old. She'd just gotten back from traveling for 6 months alone in India. Now, that tells me that she's pretty resourceful. She's adaptable. There's a lot of skills there that are not really on her resume that allowed her to fit into my team very easily. I
hear the same thing spoken about elite college, university, or even high school athletes, right? They come with a certain, DNA that is demonstrable, but not always on the resume, right?
Great example. Yeah. You can also, in your team, you can draw out, even in your existing team, draw out what those hidden assets are. So for example, and it's not rocket science to do this. I led a session with, a Fortune 1000 company. They are in the online retail space, and they had a team that hadn't gotten together since COVID, and a lot of new players as well. And they finally did get together face to face. So I helped lead their meeting. It was a one-day session, but we had everybody just come into the room ready to talk about what are 3, really poignant experiences they've had in their lives. It could be business or personal, that really shaped them to be who they are today. And what are the strengths that those led to? Super simple. And we just, we paired people up, had people have conversations, and then we had those pairs get into groups of 6 people, so 3 pairs. And then they all, kind of shared an extrapolation of those stories. And what they were able to do is recognize the assets that existed in that team at a much more strategic, higher level. And after we did that, we said, okay, look at all these amazing assets sitting in the room. How do we leverage these to achieve our annual goals and strategies? So there's a way to kind of pull out from your team strengths that exist that people may not always be aware of or even talking about, and appreciating with each other too. I mean, that process itself really creates a connection between people and trust.
Yeah, I like how you kind of take on that old chestnut, no I in teams. Where there's all basically what you're saying is, you build a team that looks like yourself, and you're going to get predictable outcomes, not necessarily innovation. Is that a fair statement?
So on the one hand, you could say there's a little bit of truth and there's no I in teams. But on the other hand, what I say is every individual member is an I. They're an individual. And the power of a team is to leverage the strengths of every one of those individuals. And so, that's where I think the example I just gave with that online retailer, and then also, being able to be a leader who uncovers that for your team and for those individuals so that everyone can step up and contribute what they have to offer.
I mean, talking about these, let's hone in on team IQ or team EQ. How do you measure such a thing? How do you know if you've developed that? If you're a leader and you say, this is my objective, I've read this amazing book and I really want to get there. How do you know when you're there?
Great question. There's a couple ways. One is qualitatively, where you see people tapping into and talking about what they're looking for from others and contributing from this themselves, that reference or connect to non-work related experiences. Everybody has their outside of work world. And a lot of times we actually have assets that we're contributing. And so that's just a very qualitative measure. I saw a lot of that in that team building activity I talked about. But there's other things that you can focus on around how much is this team, questions. I've got an assessment that teams sometimes use, but things like how much are we intentionally looking at what happened in the last year through our experiences that's shaping what we're doing today and how we're going to move forward into the future, shaping it, either holding us back or empowering us. So, to be kind of that after action review or retrospectives, whatever you might want to call it, but being able to do that is one, important, thing to do. And you can measure that sort of, you can survey and assessment.
All right. Well, last question for you. Advice for retailers. And I'm going to frame it in 2 starts and 1 stop. 2 things based on your book and your writing and your experience that they should start doing if they're not, and 1 thing they should probably stop. Maybe it doesn't work anymore. Maybe that you see it way too often based on your experiences and learning. What are your 2 starts and 1 stop?
Yeah, thank you. I think the starts are look for those, what I call hidden strengths, and draw them out. Number 1, in yourself. So if you're leading, if you're in retail and you're leading a team and you're trying to drive forward your strategy, think about how you connect the dots for yourself to the different things you've done in your life, work as well as non-work, and the strengths that they've given to you. And sometimes you need to have a reality check with somebody else you trust, like a coach or, a mentor or whatever. But the idea is look at and understand your own strengths so you can leverage those. And then number 2 would be do the same thing, but for your team. And look at, I'm an innovation guy. So, on your team, look for people who have worked with, some of the product companies perhaps that you're selling, or, have some insight around the vertical markets you're serving, and leverage what's in your team that from an innovation angle so that you can, figure out what that next thing is you need to do, whether it's a product, process, service, customer experience, whatever that is. So find the innovation seeds within your team that already exist and leverage those.
Now, what should you stop doing?
I think that it is a little counterintuitive. Don't only look forward. And it's important to look forward. We have to understand where we're going. We have to understand trends. We have to understand changing customer needs. And if you only look forward, you're going to miss what worked 6 months ago that you can leverage that's scalable, or what you might have on your team that you can then apply to a completely new context without reinventing the wheel. It's that scalable, experiential strength that exist. So look forward, but don't only look forward. You need to complement that with looking at experiences and what they've given to you and your team to leverage as you move forward.
Well, great advice from an innovation expert. My guest is Soren Kaplan. The book is Experiential Intelligence. Where can folks, Soren, if they need to or want to get a hold of you or learn a bit more, your LinkedIn person, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
My personal website, sorenkaplan.com, SorenKaplan.com. You can get the first chapter of my book right there, download it, and I'm also on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. And I'll put a link in the show notes so folks can, as I did, pick up a copy of your book or where you love to buy books. Well, listen, thanks so much for spending time with me. It was a great read. I really enjoyed the book and really enjoyed our conversation. I think it really helped, it really helped form some thoughts I've been thinking around the innovation process, particularly as it responds to team. And your last stop is super interesting. So, Soren, thanks so much for joining me on The Voice of Retail. It was a real treat getting to know you.
A real pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure to check out my other retail industry media properties, Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis, and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, consumer growth consultant, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company Inc, Maven Media, and keynote speaker. If you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Safe travels, everyone.